Hello and welcome back to Genealogy Tutorials. In this video, I am going to talk about something that haunts all of us, and that naturally is death. Grim way to start out the video, I know, but this is actually a pretty happy video because I am going to walk you through the best resource for genealogy, and that is a death certificate. So it really dawned on me that because I tailor these videos to people just starting out in genealogy and people who really don't know how to do any research, that a lot of the people watching this video might have never seen a death certificate before, because people who aren't doing genealogy really have no reason to look at a death certificate. Why else would you look at a death certificate? So a really common question that I get is where to start. Where do I start with genealogy? And I always recommend find the death certificate first. A lot of us know who our grandparents were, we remember our grandparents, we know when they died, but we really don't know anything past our grandparents. So a great way to start off genealogy is to find the death certificate for your grandparent, because death certificates have dates of birth, places of birth, names of parents, even mothers' maiden names, which are huge brick walls. When you get farther back, it gets harder and harder to find maiden names of women. So when you do find a maiden name, it's like the heavens have opened. So I am just going to start off by showing you what a death certificate looks like. And obviously, depending on where in the world you're researching, these could look different. This right here is a pretty standard layout for death certificates once we get into the 20th century. And this is a Canadian one, but this is what most of them in the United States look like as well. Most states mandated official death certificates beginning late 1800s, early 1900s. So let's just look at this death certificate right now. This is for Annie Hutchinson. She was my fourth great grandmother. She lived in New Brunswick. And actually, if you're looking for death certificates in New Brunswick, they're all for free. Canada is great. Thank you, Canada. It just depends where you're looking for death certificates. Some cost money, some are free, and I'll go through that later. But anyway, first, this is what a death certificate looks like. So they always start off with place of death. So we see here that Annie died in Fredericton. Death certificates are also really helpful because they can give their actual street address. So this one, see, it says she died in house 124, Woodstock Road in Fredericton. And if you go down here, it says her residence, that was her residence. So if I were to look up land records or anything like that, or purchases, sales of homes, I might be able to use this clue here to further my research in that area. So that's one great aspect of death certificates. They give you addresses. So detailed, right? I actually looked up this address on Google Street View, and it's still there. It's a beautiful house on a river in Fredericton, New Brunswick. That's where she lived. Really cool. The next thing that you'll get from death certificates is how long the person has lived in the city that they died in, which is also really helpful because then you can begin to trace their moves. She lived in Fredericton for 11 years before her death. She lived in New Brunswick, however, her whole life. So we know that 11 years before she died, she lived somewhere else. So that tells you that when you're looking at census data, you might not find her in a Fredericton census. You might find her you will find her in another town. So death certificates are really helpful in sort of tracing the movement of people, more generally speaking. So I went over residence. Now you get down to her age, just the basic vital statistics, where she was born, how old she was when she died, and her parents' names. So I'll just start here. Obviously, you get the gender of the person who died. You get their nationality, where they have citizenship. So this could be helpful if you find a death certificate for an ancestor that you know who immigrated and you weren't sure if they ever were naturalized or not. If it does say in this case it's Canada, but if we were operating in the US, if it does say USA, then you know to look for naturalization records, declarations of naturalization. So that's a good hint. You get racial origin, which is interesting. Hers says Scotch. So I'm going to tell you a little story with this. Her father, I know, immigrated from Ireland. Actually, I know that because down here it says her father's name and where he was born, Ireland. However, and just for the record, I traced her mother's line. I'm familiar with that family, and they are not Scottish. So when I saw Scotch, I was like, it says her father's Irish, but she marks her racial origin as Scotch. So that tells me that her father was probably Scotch-Irish, which means that he likely came from Ulster. I'll spare you the details of that whole history, but a lot of you probably already know it. And also on top of that, a lot of Scotch-Irish did come to New Brunswick. So that gives me sort of a clue in where to look for information if I ever start to research her father. I know even though it says he was born in Ireland, he's not going to be born in Cork or Dublin. I'm pretty certain, 99.999% certain, that he's going to be born up north. So racial origin, while it seems kind of self-explanatory, can give you really cool hints like that. So make sure to pay attention to that. Number 7, single, married, widowed, or divorced. This also seems self-explanatory, but it does give you a good hint in where to research the spouse of the person. We see she is a widow, so that tells us that her husband had died before her, so we can put that in our notes if we're researching her husband. I've never seen one that says divorced. I think that would be super cool because then you know to look for divorce records. And so it also gives birthplace. So whereas before you were just looking at her death, now you know where she was born. Now you can trace it back even farther. So you know she was born in Chipman, New Brunswick, and it even gives the exact date of birth, which is super cool. So then it gives you the age that she was when she died. It also gives the husband's name, which is really helpful if you have no idea who she's married to. And this is my favorite part, the father, his birthplace, and the mother and her birthplace. This is so helpful, awesomely helpful, because now you've just gone back an entire generation. Just in this one document, you've got so much information to work with. So John Hutchinson was born in Ireland, Mary White was born in Chipman. And so down here, name of informant, it tells you who's informing the coroner of all these details as he's writing them down, and how the informant is related to the person who died. And really quick, it's important to note that some of the information given on death certificates can be wrong, because sometimes the informants are just neighbors who unfortunately stumbled across a dead body. The informants are always, I believe, or usually the people who find the deceased. They inform the coroner of the information that they know. But sometimes the informant will say, I last saw the deceased on such and such date, living, and they have to sign their name. So I could be totally wrong on the informant being the person who saw them dead. That might be totally wrong. But anyway, it's important to note the relationship to the deceased. This is their daughter, so we can be fairly certain that the information in this is correct. But if it just says neighbor or something, take everything with a grain of salt, because I have seen death certificates, and I'll show you the next one that we look at. Everything can be wrong and off, so it is important to note that. So over on this side, we have her date of death, the exact date. We have the cause of death. This can be really cool. I've seen some that were suicides. I've seen some that were homicides. This obviously just old age, but that can be interesting if you're into that grim detail. It says if she's pregnant, which can also be a little grim. Any operations that the deceased had. If the death was due to external causes, so again, homicides or suicides, that can be really interesting. And with this, you can also look up court records if you're wanting to get those details. Then obviously it's signed by the coroner. I think that's the coroner. You know, now I'm realizing I should know more about what happens when someone dies. Oh, it's a doctor. Is a doctor the same as a coroner? Or coroners, MDs? I don't know. Also on this side it has the undertaker's name. So this death certificate doesn't have it, but some death certificates also give you the place of burial. Oh, it does. It says it right here. Okay, Gagetown. Well, some get as specific to say the actual cemetery name, which can be super helpful because then you can go on Find a Grave, which I will do another tutorial on because now I'm realizing a lot of people probably don't know what Find a Grave is. But if you do know the place of burial, you can go on Find a Grave, see their actual tombstone, and using Find a Grave you can see if they have any relatives on there, but that's for another video. So this is just all the awesome things you can get from a death certificate. Super grim, but this is why I tell people who are just starting out with genealogy to start with death. It's the most recent, the most recent milestone in someone's life. Can I say that? So, you know, in my experience, it's always easiest to start with the more recent milestones and work your way back. Obviously, that's what genealogy is, working your way back. Okay, here is another death certificate. Just wanted to show you this really quick because I find it very interesting. This is my third great-grandfather, and his name was actually Joel, not Joe, as it says here. And you will see that the reason his name is wrong is because no one knew who he was when he died. They knew he was a man, they knew he was white, they knew he was single. Actually, he was divorced, but no one knew anything about his life because he had murdered his friend, got into a bunch of trouble. His wife was like, no thank you, and divorced him. And poor old Joel moved down south to Missouri and lived out his life as a single old bachelor. So the person informing the coroner of his death didn't know his date of birth, didn't really know his age, said about 89. He just worked his gardening because he was frickin' 89 years old, but good for Joel. And I just love this. Birthplace. The old man was a bachelor and died here in this vicinity, not having any relations. / the information is lacking. Birthplace, don't know. They didn't really know anything. So it helps that I already knew who this was. Otherwise, this would drive me frickin' nuts if all of this was like, don't know. It does make you reflect on someone's life, though, when you see this. I mean, this is the last document that's ever filled out for someone, and just for it all to say, he didn't know anyone, we didn't really know him, and now he's dead. I mean, that's kind of sad. Maybe I'm the only one who thinks that, but I think it's kind of sad. So as I was researching Joel's last years down south, I noticed that for about 30 years, every 10 years, he was a boarder to a different family. And I did trace all of his footsteps, and I actually found that Tom Webb was one of the people that he lived with. I found this Tom Webb in a census, and he had a boarder named Joel who lived with him. So it's just cool when you can make those connections. I mean, otherwise this is just a name on a certificate, but then you realize, oh, Joel was living with this guy as a boarder, but even he didn't know anything about his life. So it would seem that Joel, after everything went down, after the murder, after his wife divorced him, he abandoned his family, he left. It seemed like he didn't really talk at all about that. I mean, even the guy that he lived with had no idea what his life was. So it's kind of sad. So now I'm gonna talk to you about how you can actually find a death certificate. And it really depends what state you're looking in or what country you're looking in. The one from New Brunswick that I showed you was totally accessible online because, again, thank you, Canada, totally free. That's at the Canadian Archives. Some states have it online so that you can see the names and the dates of death, but you can't actually see the certificate. So Washington State death certificates, for example, are searchable on the Washington State Secretary of State website. Same with Missouri. The one that I just showed you was searchable on the Secretary of State of Missouri's website, and it was viewable for free. But what you get when you go to Washington, let me just show you this, are the names of the individual, where they died, when they died. And you click it and you get some information. You get their date of death, their age, their mother's name. This was actually Annie Hutchinson that I just showed you the death certificate for. This is her son. This is my great-grandfather, Arthur. So you get details like this, but if you actually want to view the certificate, you have to order it. So every state is different. Some states just throw them at you saying, here, we don't need money for this. Other states like Washington are a bit more stingy and they want to charge you $20 for them. So I hope this was interesting for some of you. I hope it was helpful to go through what all a death certificate has, and I hope it was interesting to see what a death certificate actually looks like. I have no idea what they look like nowadays. I assume not too different from the ones back in the day. If you have any questions, leave them down below. If you want any more in-depth explanations of death certificates, let me know in the comments and I will try to address those. Thank you.